Hello students, today we will take up another very important topic, that is theory of poetic diction from the lyrical ballads. In his preface, Wordsworth gives his views in detail about the language used for the purpose of poetry. Poetry, he says, does not require any special language or special devices. Wordsworth was of the opinion that the poet is essentially a man speaking to man, so he must use the language of man in real life. The neoclassical poets advocated that the language of poetry was different from the language of prose, whereas Wordsworth declared that it might be safely affirmed that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and the language of poetry. He further goes on to say that the principal object in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as possible in a selection of language really used by men, and at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect, and further and above all to make these incidents and situations interesting. Wordsworth says that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and poetry. He advocated that simple people live close to nature, speak a simple and plainer language, which is therefore necessarily the best language. The simple dwellers of rural area have direct communion with the forces of nature and are capable of strong emotions. Since their surroundings are narrow, they feel and live in greater intensity of experience. There is no trace of sophistication in their lives and emotions, but it does not mean that Wordsworth was not conscious of the roughness or crudity of the language of ordinary people. To avoid this, he spoke of a selection of language. The language of the rustics and humble people, after proper selection, becomes dignified and capable of imparting pleasure. What Wordsworth means is that the words used in conversation, if they are properly selected, would provide the rough framework of the language of poetry. Wordsworth refers to the real language of men. Wordsworth claims that the poet should use a selection of the language really used by men. But there has been much controversy whether Wordsworth himself has made use of such language in his poetry. A thorough survey of his poems reveals that he has frequently used simple and even rustic words. His poetry is free from the pomposity or the show of the school of Pope. There are many poems in which Wordsworth followed his own professed language. He introduced ease and simplicity into these poems. As for example, Lucy Gray, Michael, The Solitary Reaper, The Education of Nature, etc., are practical examples of Wordsworth's theory of language for poetry, and they are admittedly very famous poems. But there are other poems like Tintin Abbey, The Immortality Ode, etc., which do not follow Wordsworth's own theory. These poems are grand. Even here, one can say that Wordsworth uses the phrases and words which are not artificial. There is an emotional fervor and vigorous imagination which colors these poems of philosophical import. The language of prose and the language of rustics are apparently not suitable to these poems. The language used in these poems is also appropriate to their thought. Thus, it cannot be claimed that Wordsworth used common man's language in almost all of his poems. In fact, Wordsworth's poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and hence it is not apt to judge it strictly on the basis of language used in it. Wordsworth often wrote superbly, and he often wrote in a stiff, heavy, pedestrian style. But neither in the one case nor in the other had doctrine anything to do with the quality of his work.